All right, folks, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tommy Ferguson. I'm the Executive Director for Capital City Village. For those of you who may not be as familiar with us, we are a local nonprofit and we focus on providing supportive services as well as engaging programs for Austin seniors. The goal is to help them age in place for as long as possible. So some of the programs include social opportunities, and then other ones include informational, timely programs like this one this afternoon. So I would like to thank you. If you'd like to learn some more about Capital City Village, I encourage you to visit our website, capitalcityvillage.org. We have some other great programs coming up, so please do check out our events page, including our annual fundraiser, Keep Aging Weird, and that's scheduled for November 10th. It will be a hybrid event in person at the Norris Conference Center in Austin, as well as live streamed. So again, thank you for giving us some of your time this afternoon. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn things over to Mart Hoffman, who's actually going to introduce our speaker, and then we'll let things go from there. We'll get a great presentation, and there will be time for questions and answers afterwards. So Mart, if you would take it away.
Thank you, Tommy. We're very glad today to have as our guest speaker, Ed McCourse, and I want to give you a bit of his background before he starts. It's rather distinguished. He is a graduate of McCallum High School, University, and the University of Texas Law School, quite a combination. And his proud parents are Tom and Kay McCourse. Most of y'all probably know them. He's a partner with the firm McGinnis Lockridge, where he specializes in transactional law. Ed and Kathy are the parents of 3 children, Grant, Allison, and Ben, and they're going to force themselves to go see Ben in a few weeks in Florence, Italy, where he's studying abroad. Sounds like a painful thing to have to do. Ed's concern for people living with the homeless began while on the Caritas board. It expanded as one of the founding leaders of ECHO, Indian Community Homelessness Coalition. His leadership, public presentations, endless meetings, and participation in annual count of people experiencing homelessness are part of his many yearly commitments. I want to give a brief word about Ed. I had a small hand in raising him, and so I know a number of stories, and this is probably the best one. When he was about 13, his dad and I and the youth director from Tarrytown Methodist went to the Gila Wilderness near Silverton, New Mexico. And we had about 12 campers with us. We backpacked into the wilderness, camped by this beautiful stream. We're coming and had a delightful experience. And Ed then was helpful and responsible as he is now. But coming back, we had a new white van, and Ed was in the very back, and his father was driving, and we went through the hamburger stand, and then there was a big loop of cars riding through this little town. So Tom's idea of fun was to get in the loop of cars and honk. And with that, Ed kind of got in the very back of the bus and pulled his hat over his eyes, and he kind of moaned and said, "Oh, Dad, oh, Dad." This went on for about 20 minutes. So he may have, I think he remembers this incident, but it was right hilarious. So Ed's a longtime friend now, a good friend, and we'd like to welcome him and his presentation. Ed.
Thank you, Mart. I will say that I do remember that experience, and I have made an effort to repeat that that parenting activity with my own children to embarrass them as extensively as possible in a public setting, or semi-public setting. So, well, thank you all. I appreciate the invitation to come back and visit with CCV again on the issue of homelessness. It is an issue that I have spent a lot of time thinking about, talking to people who are smarter than me about how we address it, really starting to understand more about it. I did first get involved in the issue back in 1999 when I joined the Caritas board. Was on the Caritas board for 6 years, and then in 2008 or 2009 I joined ECHO. Back then, ECHO was really 2 informal groups that had come together who were trying to coordinate the homeless response system in Austin and Travis County. But it wasn't a formal entity. It was kind of the city had the purse strings, but all the agencies that, whether it's Caritas or SAFE or Trinity, they were the ones trying to do the work, but do it in a coordinated manner. And so in 2012, we actually formed ECHO as a freestanding entity. And it took over responsibility for kind of the advocacy, coordination, and kind of what I would call the glue pieces of a response system. Initially, that meant being responsible for the annual HUD, federal HUD grant. Every year, HUD requires an application and it gives money to communities to help address housing for the homeless. And so we coordinated that to make sure we presented the best possible community application rather than each individual agency application to maximize the funding and the way in which the community could respond to use these funds to respond and move people off the streets. We also manage what's called the Homeless Management Information System, which is a database that collects information on the services and housing that is available, and then the people who reach out for those services and then coordinates that. So it gives us a pretty rich database from which to understand those who are experiencing homelessness, what their needs are, what their characteristics are, how those change over time, which of our systems for responding to homelessness work, and how well. And I'll show you some of that data here at the end on the ECHO website where you can actually go and see exactly how well things are working. And then we've also, so I think of ECHO's role now as advocacy and policy and best practices, and then filling in these glue areas. One of the areas, just as one more example, and then I'll get started, is we have what's called a coordinated entry system where the different agencies and ECHO interview people who are in need of housing, who are on the street or who are about to become homeless, and find out what their needs are, how vulnerable they are, and figure out which program or intervention is most likely to be successful. And then essentially, as much as I hate to say this right now, how vulnerable are they? Because the more vulnerable you are, the higher you are on the list. We do not do a who's been on the list the longest approach. We try to respond. It's almost more of a triage system. And so we have played that role because individual agencies don't have the wherewithal to do that and then put it into a coordinated system. That has resulted in a system where we have what's called a by name list. So the agencies, the key agencies all sit down once a month and basically pull up their list of people who are experiencing homelessness, who need to find housing, and figure out who can provide it. So you may have come into Caritas and had your coordinated entry done, but it may be that SAFE is the best place, or Family Elder Care has the resources that are best for you. So we try to do it on a basis. It's really a community basis. So anytime I'm talking about us, I rarely mean ECHO. I really mean the community response system. So with that, let me get started. I'm going to jump through relatively quickly some of the information, the background information, kind of set the stage, and then I'll try to spend most time actually on questions, but before that, most of the time on what has happened since January. We've had two really big things that have happened that have impacted how Austin is responding to homelessness. So common question, risk factors for homelessness. We've got the community level, income inequality, educational issues, lack of affordable housing, huge issue, growing issue in Austin right now. As Mark indicated, I've got 3 kids. One of them is out of college and living in Austin. Got her first apartment last January, and I think she's living with her roommate, and they're paying $2,000 a month for a little 2-bedroom, and just got notice that their apartment complex is now charging $3,000 a month for that same apartment in just that 1 year's change, because of the growth in Austin, the demand. Although it looks like we're building an apartment complex on every corner, the availability of that affordable housing is really kind of going through the roof. Even more so for the Class C apartments, that is primarily where you would find people who are at this level of the poverty scale. When you see a new big apartment complex going up, it's because they tore down something that was affordable generally, or something that was otherwise providing housing for someone. Poverty at the family level, poverty, family violence. At the individual level, abuse, neglect coming out of the foster care system is just an absolute, indicator of a likelihood of homelessness, because they're getting better. They've developed more systems, but historically, you're coming out of the, you turn 18 or 19, you come out of foster care, and you don't have a support network. You don't have parents to call. You don't have a church group to reach out to. And so a real high indicator of ending up homeless. And then on an immediate basis, you'll have domestic abuse issues that will lead to that quickly, addiction, incarceration, all sorts of things like that. So there's a whole bunch of issues that come from different places at all sorts of different levels that result in people being homeless, which is part of what makes it so challenging then to get people rehoused, because you can't just say as easily as here's an apartment, you're good to go. You've got to address some of these underlying issues. You've probably heard me say, if you've heard me talk about this at all, that the common factor through most of these is the lack of a support system, that by the time people become homeless, their social safety net doesn't exist anymore. And it may not have been very good to begin with if they grew up in poverty, if they grew up in family violence. But the things that you would look at and say will keep you from ever being on the street have all evaporated, sometimes due to addiction, sometimes due to just a lack of available resources. In terms of what does Austin look like? This is from the last time we did the full count, which was at the end of for 2020. You'll see 1,574 unsheltered, 932 sheltered people. This is a one-time count we do in January where we go and physically count how many people are out there. So this does not represent how many people are homeless over the course of a year. That number is about 4,000 to 5,000. This is actually just a snapshot in time. And what you'll see here is not surprisingly with the coronavirus, we had a decrease in sheltered homelessness, primarily because we had the emergency shelters were being closed down or spaced out. So we didn't have as many opportunities for people to be in shelters. And so you saw an increase in overall homelessness, but you also saw a fairly significant increase in unsheltered homelessness that was really driven by the coronavirus. What this shows is the numbers over time. In the left column, they're just the raw numbers, and you see this, they went down for a few years and now they're going back up. You see the Travis County population just increasing on a straight line, and then the point in time count per capita. And that's what you see is, although it's kind of dipped and coming back up, it's really stayed relatively constant. And that's something just to think about when you're trying to figure out what's happening in homelessness in Austin or any community. Is remember, as we grow as a community, as Austin and Travis County grow, you're going to have a growth in the number of people who are homeless for all the many factors we just talked about, but just some percentage of your population is getting pushed out, is suffering from domestic violence, is suffering from mental health issues or alcoholism or all the things that then get you there. So it doesn't feel like that because you see people more, but on a relative basis, we've been able to at least not have the explosions that you've seen in places, some of the places like California, LA in particular, and some of those. Something I always like to come back to is, where did people first become homeless? You get a lot of anecdotes when I talk to people. I get a lot of anecdotes around, well, if we offer too many services, everybody will want to come here. What this shows is that fairly consistently over, and this is a pretty consistent we've seen over the last 10 years, is, was it 60 to 65% of people had a place to live in Austin when they became homeless. Another 20% were somewhere in Texas. And generally that means sometimes it's going to be Houston and Dallas, San Antonio. More often it means they were in Temple or Elgin or Lockhart. And so there are no services in those communities. There are no jobs in those communities generally. So just like you have people coming to Austin because there's a chance to go work for Tesla or do other things, people who are experiencing homelessness come to Austin because they think they can get a job. They think they can find a way to support themselves. It is a place of economic opportunity. But this is kind of what we've seen pretty consistently. There's only about 15 to 20% that tend to come from out of state and make their way to Austin. I don't have any good information on whether that is they're coming from really cold places or for family or what it might be, but that's generally what we've seen. We talked about a little about this. We have a disproportionate number of African Americans who are homeless relative to our population. All in all, if you look at the homeless population, very high level, it's about a little more than a third African American, a little more than a third Hispanic, and a little less than a third white. And then if you look at that and compare it to the population of Austin Travis County, you'll see that, as I've got on here, African Americans represent only about 8% of Travis County, but 35% of the homeless population. And what we've been doing is trying to address that and make sure that our systems for rehousing people are equitable. And we find ways to adjust and be sure that to the extent, well, we know not to the extent there are structural issues that are leading to a higher incidence of homelessness amongst African Americans, that we recognize that and address that, and certainly do not perpetuate that system as we try to provide services and house people. This is one of the slides, and I'll take you to the website here in a minute when we're done. But this is where I was talking about, we've started tracking this kind of data on a month-by-month basis. And so here you'll see that what this is going to show us is the change in unsheltered homelessness on the top, that starting in June kind of started to go up again from 2,200 to a little over 2,400. And sheltered homelessness also started going up again, really starting in August, or maybe going back to April. But this is something that we update on a monthly basis on the ECHO website, so you can see, rather than just that point in time count, what are we seeing in terms of the number of people experiencing homelessness. The sheltered homelessness, that should be going up. We should be seeing some of that because of the efforts that have been made recently to get people into transitional housing. One of the opportunities that became available starting in, I think it was February or March, was the city of Austin initiated what they called the HEAL program. And they set aside some money and they said, okay, we're going to go to some of the campsites, the encampments that you see. They picked some of the high profile ones. So they started with the one over at the I think it's the Terrazas Library over on East Cesar Chavez. If you drove by there 6 months ago, you would have seen tents all along Cesar Chavez, kind of around the corner of that library there. And so they started by saying, we're going to go and we're going to offer transitional housing. Anyone we can get from that campsite to together move to a motel where we can, then go find them a more permanent place. We will ask them to do that, give them the opportunity to. And the idea was to recognize that, one, we need to do it on a location basis. The city was very interested in reducing the exposure, but also the publicity and exposure and visibility. But it also was trying to recognize that these are communities, right? Humans are community builders, and so when you see people living together in areas, generally there's some level of community there. So that's why we tried to move them together, come to them and approach them all at one time. That first one, the numbers I have heard is about 60% moved into transitional housing, and the other 40% chose not to. They chose to just move off of that location and go other places. Lots of reasons for that. I don't know that we were able to track the details of the individual reasons, but oftentimes you see that because we were probably, this particular motel was probably a single room occupancy. So they could have had a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend. They could have had a pet that might not have been allowed. They might have just not been comfortable in a group setting with, those kinds of issues. So you see a lot of different drivers on people, and frankly, people when they're ready to accept help. So the 60% number was pretty good. We'd hope it would be higher. But they did that at Terrazas. They did that on Cesar Chavez between Congress and First Street. And they did that over on 71 Ben White, I think around when Menchaca hits there. So it was been a targeted program. We're still working on the data to figure out what's the success rate in getting people moved from this transitional housing into permanent housing. So, truly getting them off the streets and not just in a shelter that is still on a temporary basis. The temporary shelters are great, but they're not a solution that is intended to last long term. Okay, so when we visited in January, Prop B was on the ballot. It said, let's go back and put in place these ordinances that are so-called quality of life ordinances. They prohibited camping in public spaces. They prohibited sitting or lying down on sidewalks downtown. They prohibited panhandling, and all of that was a Class C misdemeanor. Prop B passed, and so all of those are now ordinances in the city of Austin now. You have probably seen the most visible part of that has been a reduction in the number of tents. The camping piece of that is the most visible part of any of that. It's what really, I believe, drove Prop B. And so that has started to be enforced. The city is phasing in enforcement warnings, trying not to get back to where we were writing tickets for everybody again. And so what this has done is you have seen, I believe you've seen a decrease in the visible unsheltered population. You've got more people that are, off into the green spaces, or frankly, you don't notice someone in a sleeping bag the same way you notice someone in a tent. So it's just everything has become a little less visible, a little more mobile too. The tents, when you have a tent, you stay there a little more, you gather a few more things. If you're in a sleeping bag, you may be moving it from one underpass to, this park. And so it's not quite as substantial. It's not quite as much of an undertaking. So we've seen that happen again. And what we've seen is that, what we haven't seen yet, because it's still too early, is, the big challenge is once you start to get these tickets, if you don't respond to them, if you don't go down to community court and deal with them, they can be an impediment to getting housed. Criminal background checks are run on everybody who wants housing by private landlords. And we do a lot of our contracting. The way we get people housed is not by building new places. It takes too long. We go and we enter into contracts with landlords and say, listen, we'll give you the security deposit. We'll cover the damages if there's any problem on move out. We'll have a social worker there who you can call upon to help if you have any sort of, social interaction issues. And so, but they still want to run background checks. And so we have to work with them to say, let's figure out what counts as something that's a problem on your background check. But, active warrants because you didn't show up at community court because you got a ticket for camping or laying down on the sidewalk, those make it harder to get people housed. This is a snapshot that shows where we've been able to get people moved into housing. There's three different ways we get people moved. And this is not the transitional housing. This is when we get them past transitional housing. But wanted to show you something that indicates that we do have people moving out of the system. This is not just a constantly growing population. Unfortunately, it's a flow. New people come in, we get people housed, and it's a process that we're still trying to reduce the income also. But we've got three different types. Minimal housing assistance is the one in yellow here. That's when we're able to really get people reconnected with their safety net. It may be that we are able to get them connected with a grandmother who will agree to take them in. And what we can do is provide some support because if a grandmother on fixed income is taking on her, 22-year-old grandson, the food budget changes. The electricity budget, the apartment may say, well, we're going to charge you a little more if that's the case. So it helps us with that. It also, we're able to do security deposits. We're able to kind of help clear out some bad, like if they owed their landlord $500 in rent plus needed a security deposit. So that's when we call it minimal housing assistance, is just enough to get them back on their feet. Permanent supportive housing, that is the expensive housing. That is for the people who need not just a place to live, but they need wraparound support services. And that may be mental health assistance, substance abuse, employment assistance. It's going to be we recognize that you became homeless because there are reasons. And if we don't address those reasons, then you're going to be homeless again. And we don't expect you to be able to solve those in 6 months. It's really built around the concept of, we're going to get you the housing, which is the first step, and then we will bring the services to you. And eventually we will get you to where we think you can be self-sufficient. A lot of times people in that situation, we can get them qualified for SSI or SSDI. And so there is income sources available to help them become economically mostly self-sufficient or if not self-sufficient, but they still need the way to engage. You got to get them engaged with with community care and get them a primary health care provider. It's kind of giving them the support systems that allow them to succeed. And then rapid rehousing is the one where you've got people who are recently have become homeless. And so we're able to get them back on into housing on a quicker basis and in a way that allows them to be successful with less intervention. Unfortunately, it's just a situation where the longer you are on the streets, the harder it is for you to come back off the streets, right? So if we can catch people within 30 days, our success rate on getting them permanently rehoused is much higher than if they've been on the street for a year or 2 years. There's a guy downtown that I have seen again frequently recently, who I remember seeing him 22 years ago at 6th and Congress when he decided to climb out on a light pole. He's got the same mental health issues, probably worse than they were then because they're largely untreated. But someone like that is extremely hard for us to get rehoused. So the sooner we can catch people or even prevent it, the better. So I'm going to stop and pivot now to what is going on to substantially change the system. And because there's a lot of money about to hit the system. And fortunately, Austin started planning for that before Prop B and really separate from Prop B. We have long known that we know how to solve the problem. We know how to house people, but we have a funding problem, a scale issue that is made harder by the economic success of our city. So several groups, including the Chamber of Commerce, the Downtown Austin Alliance, and ECHO, and individuals, the St. David's Foundation, all came together to kind of try to go back and say, well, let's try to figure out what it would take to set some goals to really address the unsheltered population. And they came out with goals to try to house 3,000 individuals in the zone over 3 years, add housing capacity that would be 1,300 new units of affordable housing. So that would be on top of the market ones and the ones, Community First Village, it would be on top of all of that. And then to try to do a better system, build a system that improved on the equitable access and outcomes, provider capacity. So that meant we can't just keep doing the same thing and give everybody who's already doing it more money. We need to expand and grow the response system. And so that part is really focused on trying to help support and grow some of these smaller nonprofits and agencies that are doing good work, but don't have the infrastructure to grow on their own. So trying to help fund some of that. By the way, these slides are taken from a presentation made by the City of Austin's Homeless Strategy Officer to City Council about 2 weeks ago, as she was summarizing where we stood with the summit and the funding. And so I just stole her slides because they were good. Here's the plan. Most of this money is going to come from the recent ARPA funding that the federal government provided to the city and the county. The city's putting in about 100 million. The county's putting in about 100 million. Then they're going to raise funds from other sources to try to get to the total capacity needed. But this is their goal, as they were explaining it. Initially in year one, some capital investment, as they then go ahead and start to build the sheltered capacity, and also getting people in immediately. The breakdown, which is I think somewhat helpful, is they've been very specific and they've understood that you've got a stabilization program, you got a housing program, you have to build the infrastructure, you have to build some housing. So it's not a one solution for everything. Some of you may have heard of Haven for Hope down in San Antonio. Great complex they built down there. That worked for the city of San Antonio, kind of. They put $100 million and built a facility that would kind of move people through the system. But it was kind of a one shot, we better do this and we think we're there. I think one of the things the summit is looking at is understanding that this is not a one-shot solution. We've got to build the infrastructure to be able to maintain this. Now, we won't have this 200 million in government funding to maintain it, so we need to use that to make everything more sustainable and more durable. And so what we've got here is the ways in which the housing programs work. The first one is diversion. This is catching people immediately. This is sending them to grandma or their family, or supporting them locally, whatever it may be, if we can do it for a quick kind of a one-time intervention and be done. You'll see here on this slide, it's got the cost of these things. And so the average cost is $4,500 for a diversion program. It goes for about 2 months as you try to get everybody stabilized. Outreach is harder. That's the people you see out under the bridges, trying to talk to people, find them, and engage them when they're ready. One of the toughest parts about getting people moved from the street into shelter is catching them at the right time. So many of these people struggle with either mental health or substance abuse or both, that you may get a response on Monday that's a no, but if you catch them on Wednesday, you can get to a yes. And it's not unlike what you all have probably read about, or maybe even personally experienced with friends or family going through addiction issues, right? There's a lot of denial until you can get to a point where there's a yes and a willing to accept help. And so one of the things I always think is important is it's a journey, not I asked you, you said you weren't ready for housing, and that means that you just enjoy living on the streets. That's a myth, in my opinion. The bridge shelter is a new concept that is very good, and when we were working on, fortunately, we were working on it here in Austin when COVID hit. It's the idea, and you've heard about them, it's taking a motel and converting it into temporary housing for people experiencing homelessness, or during the COVID period, for people who needed to get segregated or separated from their family so they didn't infect the rest of their family or the people living in their household. And so we had actually been looking at this program, working on it, and then we're able to rotate it in with COVID. And now we've got some infrastructure through hotels and motels that were used for both protective housing, is what they called it, when they were separating people, to prevent the spread of the infection. But these bridge shelters allow us to get people in, get them stabilized. A lot easier to get someone stabilized with a roof over their head and a lock on their door than it is when they're under MOPAC in 2222 today, and tomorrow may be somewhere where we can't find them again. It's a lot more helpful. So it's got the cost there. And then the housing programs are the rapid re-exit that we talked about, and then going all the way up to the permanent supportive housing. But the concepts are, again, it's not a one size fits all. Get people placed, get them identified, get them placed in the program that makes the most sense for them, that is going to be the most effective for them and the most cost effective for the system, so we can house as many people as possible. I'll send these slides out along with a couple other links. I want to share one more thing before I stop talking, and you can tell me what all you wanted to hear that I didn't talk about. Let's see. There's that. Apologies for my delay while we switch over here. Okay, you should be seeing a screen that has a bunch of lines going across it. Is that what you're seeing? Yep. Okay. This is, I told you, we now have on the ECHO website. This is from the ECHO website. This is our up-to-date dashboard. This is what I showed you earlier. I pulled off into one of the slides, which is the people experiencing unsheltered homelessness by month. We've also got it broken down by race and ethnicity, age group, and housing type. So for example, if for this group, you wanted to know how's it looking on an age basis, you come here and go and look in October. We have 77 people who are unsheltered experiencing homelessness as of October 1st in Austin, Texas. We've got 255 that are 18 to 24, and you can just kind of see how it moves up and down, and see what those numbers are. If that's something that's of interest, what does the population look like? You can look at it by race and ethnicity, and this is what I was telling you. This is Hispanic, Black, non-Hispanic, and white, all kind of up there together. And this one then shows you whether you're talking about families with children or you're talking about individuals and adults. And then we can do the same thing down here with the people who are in shelters. But this has really been very helpful to get a better sense on a real-time basis instead of just that snapshot as to what's going on. We also have the ability to look over here and see, are we getting people moved in? You know, this is kind of our success dashboard here. This shows the number of, this one isn't going to move as much because this one up top shows the capacity, right? And it takes time to build more beds, more capacity. Down here, though, it shows us what move-ins are happening. Are we getting people moved into rapid rehousing pretty quickly? You know, looks like we're averaging probably about 100 people a month getting moved off the streets and into some sort of permanent housing through rapid rehousing. Permanent supportive housing is at a lower rate. As I indicated, it's a lot harder and a lot more expensive. And then for all of these, what we have seen is that from the day you become homeless, we are tracking like from your first day of homelessness to when do we get you to fill out that coordinated entry that I talked about, to when do we get you identified to a program and when do we get you into housing. The average is about a year. It takes about a year for us to get someone all the way through the process. And that means we're going to have some people on the way high side that have been homeless for years and years, and some that we get done real quickly. But unfortunately, it's a process that is not move as quickly as it should, because when you start to kind of, when I was talking about what it takes to move into an apartment, it takes an ID, right? If you lost your driver's license along the way, you got to go deal with that. You may have to deal with some citations, but it's a process to get people there and get them ready. So that is my not as quick as I intended overview. So why don't I stop and see who has questions and what are the holes in my presentation?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Who has a question? Susan Gilbert, do you have a question?
Did she ever hand it?
I thought so. Okay. I have a question. Am I on? Can you hear?
I think Susan may have just been on mute.
Okay. Susan, go ahead. Get off
No,
mute.
It's a very good presentation and I'm really interested, especially since I live downtown. But I didn't have a question.
Okay. Well, if you live downtown, you've probably seen the biggest just visibility impact from the passage of Prop 8. You know, I work downtown and that's the place you saw the tents go down the quickest. But you didn't necessarily see the people disappear. There's a woman that I had seen around and all of a sudden I just saw her sitting on the sidewalk on a blanket out in front of Chick-fil-A, the new Chick-fil-A at 6th and Congress, every single day. So the people didn't go away, but the tents did. So.
Yeah, I agree.
Who else has a question? Somebody else?
Stephanie Ryan has a
Stephanie
question.
Ryan has raised her
Stephanie.
hand. Go ahead.
Yes, hi there. Ed, thank you for taking the time to do this presentation for us. And I enjoyed your first one as well. And I follow homelessness pretty closely. I had looked over ECHO's annual report and tell me if I'm remembering this correctly. I thought I saw that 51% of the folks for that year were reported as chronically homeless, which tends to be the population that may need permanent supportive housing, yet very little is provided. What are your thoughts about that?
51% sounds high on the overall population. It probably was based upon the unsheltered population for the point in time count. That would make some sense. So that number does not surprise me, and it is really hard. In order to meet the chronic homelessness is a definition provided by HUD, and it means that you've been homeless for a year, or you've had 3 separate incidents of homelessness within a 2-year period. And then there's usually some additional comorbidities that go along with that. And so you're really talking about people like the guy I told you I've seen on the street for 20 years that it's a dual challenge. On the one hand, finding a spot that can meet their needs, right? A place like Community First Village that Alan Graham runs is now being built out, and actually for Lesser Rio is being built out to help with that, right? They've got space, they've got a little community, they've got a community care out there. Integral care comes out and provides mental health services. So a situation like that, but those numbers don't grow very quickly, the availability of those numbers. But that person may not do well in an apartment complex that's mixed use with 200 units and 50 are set aside for people coming out of experiencing homelessness. And that's what makes it particularly hard. And then just frankly, the funding for the wraparound services, whether it's for homeless people experiencing homelessness or anything else, our mental health and addiction services, not just in Austin, Travis County, but, nationally are pathetic. We just haven't put the
agree.
dollars there. Martin Sue can give us a separate explanation of what happened in the 80s and led to that. But I'll give you one stat just because it's one of my favorite talking points on this, which is that the largest mental health provider in Austin, Travis County is the Travis County Jail, because that's the way our system works right now. So.
Mhm. Yeah, I understand that Travis County, I've spoken with my representative on the Commissioner's Court, is doing a feasibility study right now for MH jail diversion. I know that Integral Care has done some of that. But as you said, there's more need than there are funds, basically.
And that's the hope with this summit funding, these $200 million grants. And that's why they're really going to try to not just build stuff, but build some infrastructure that maybe can support those services too. So
Thank you.
but it's a good question.
No Stout.
Yes, Ed, thanks so much. I'm new to this particular subject, so be patient with me as I ask the question. When you're talking about minimal and then permanent housing, what is incumbent upon the homeless to stay in that housing, or secondly, to move? These are just examples, to move out of that housing to gain jobs or whatever.
Sure, that's a good question. So let me start with the permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing, there is no end date. It's not 6 months or 9 months like transitional housing is. Permanent supportive housing is as long as you continue to abide by the lease. And so the folks who move into these, whether it's Community First Village or whether it's a mixed use, sign a lease, and their obligation is to make sure that they live under that lease. And then typically they've got some housing vouchers that help with the rent or cover the rent. If they're veterans, the VA has some fairly robust housing vouchers. The Austin Housing Authority also has some vouchers, some Section 8 vouchers. So that kind of gives them some long-term support on that piece of it, while we work with them to try to get them stabilized and employed if they've got the ability to be employed. But it is, you make a good point. There are rules that go with them. For permanent supportive housing, the rules though tend to be living under the terms of the lease, and not you have to get a job by a certain date. That's kind of more of a progression piece. And then for the rapid rehousing, those do have shorter time periods. Like let's switch over to that bridge housing. The goal is 6 to 9 months on that bridge housing. That ought to give us as a community enough time to help you get to a point where we can get you into a market rate apartment, find you a job if that's really what you need, if the challenge is income based. Right now, for better or for worse, right now, finding the job piece is not the hard part, right? It's having enough stability in their lives to be able to show up for that job every day. So.
Just a quick follow-up question. Let's take one area, whichever one you want. What is the success rate of moving in and moving through the process and moving out? Not in terms of days or months, but the ability to move the homeless through the process.
So ask that one more time, just to make sure I want to make sure I answer the right question.
I'm not sure
What's
I'm
the-
answering the question for sure. But
Well,
for example, hey, I'm homeless. You put me in. I've been able to get into a temporary homeless shelter. There's 100 in the homeless shelter example. How long does it? What is your success? Not yours, but what is the success rate of moving a homeless person, body, family, whatever, through the process and out for the next homeless person to occupy?
That's a good question. I've seen stats on how long it takes, but not how quickly they go from one spot to another. I'm going to put my screen up again real quick. This is something that kind of goes to that a little bit, though. What we do measure is when people engage with the system, how many stay engaged and how many fall back into homelessness, which is kind of maybe a little bit apart. It doesn't say how long till we can get them out, but how many are we unsuccessful with? And so what this shows is, not surprisingly, the lesser the less significant our interaction, the more likely they return to homelessness, right? So street outreach is really just out there talking to people and trying to get them engaged with the system. So 35% there, if that's our only interaction, return to homelessness. If we can get them into the emergency shelter, and by the way, this is within the 2 years following when we got them housed. If we can get them into emergency shelter, then it's down to only about 20%. We get them into permanent supportive housing, it's about 15%, and kind of drops from there. Safe Haven is a program, this last one, that's run by Integral Care, the mental health provider. But what we see is that if we can get them to the last part of what you're talking about, Noel, is get them into housing, that really we're down to about an 85% success rate, which is pretty phenomenal. That represents a lot of work done by the social workers and the case managers to kind of keep them engaged and there. And again, this is from this echo.
Can I call him?
So you can go and look at it this way too, and see how that changes based upon age. Looks like it stays pretty consistent. But these are all the things we're trying to measure because we're trying to figure out how to do it better, right? We look at these so we can figure out, okay, if we see we've got about a 20% rate of unsuccessful folks, then what is it about it that is leading to that? And start to try to break it down and figure out what the barriers are and what the structures are. So.
And Sue has a question.
Hi, Ed. Thanks for all of this. I wish I could absorb it all, but here's my question. Since Capital City Village is especially focused toward helping people who are over 50, I see your statistics 65 and over, 70 people on the streets. What special things are you doing to approach that population? Because as I understand it, a lot of this population has significant medical issues.
Yeah, we've got the case managers. One aspect, once they can get someone engaged, is to get the individuals connected with services, right? If they're a veteran, get them hooked up with the VA and their healthcare system. If they're over 65 and this is a big if, and a legal resident of the United States, then you can get them into Medicare, right? But if they aren't, then you have fewer support systems. So a lot of time is spent trying to engage them on the existing support systems that exist in our country and in our community to make these transitions back to housing permanent. Again, on the healthcare side, if we can get them qualified, whether there's either Medicare, Medicaid, or get them into the MAP program that Community Care and Central Health run, get them a medical home is really important. And that's just one of the many things. It's kind of like, imagine a checklist. You got a move-in checklist, but instead of it's not just, do we have a table, a couch, and a bed? It's, who's our healthcare provider? Who's our mental health provider? What's the resume status? What's the documentation status? And working through all those things. So I'm surprised that number is that high, to be honest with you, on the 65 and older. But I'll be honest with you, I'm really surprised because living on the streets is hard, and the average age of someone who is, I mean, the average life expectancy of someone living on the streets is 10 to 15 years less than what it is for someone who's not. Obviously, depending on how long you've been on the streets, but what we've seen, and we've adjusted our system a little bit, is you got to factor that in terms of you're talking to someone who hadn't been homeless for a while or someone who has. When we were doing the vulnerability assessments, one of the factors was age. So that would indicate higher vulnerability. We've had to go modify that because if you've been on the streets for, let's say, 10 years and you're 50, your life expectancy is 55. And so you're super vulnerable. If you've just become homeless at, let's say, at age 60, you may not be as vulnerable, but that age criteria we have discovered is not, it's not uniform, right? Frankly, it's not uniform across ethnicity and race, and it's certainly not uniform across anyone based on how long they have been homeless. So family elder care works real hard in this area. They do a lot of great work in terms of trying to connect the seniors to the services and to housing in particular. So.
That sounds like a daunting project. How many case managers do you have working on this?
Well, we have none because we don't do the direct service. But it's the different agencies kind of have their different areas of specialty. Caritas really is kind of focused on the working poor. So is Trinity Center. Whereas SAFE is focused on those coming out of domestic abuse and domestic violence. Family elder care is focused on the aging population. So you get a different subset, and that's why we then all come together and help coordinate the service and figure out who the right person is, so that if you happen to walk into Caritas, but really your service provider, your best service provider is Green Doors because you're a veteran, we get you over there and try to handle it that way. The only other thing I can tell you, though, on the number of case managers and social workers is not enough. So,
Thank you.
See, okay, Bob Schluter.
And we do appreciate you breaking this out and giving us details. One thing with the recent enacting of the ordinances to reduce the visibility of homelessness, has that shown up in the community attitude and maybe expressed as financially through donations, or just the level of our rateness versus complacency?
That is a good question, and I don't have a good answer because I've started to realize that I live in an echo chamber. So, everybody I'm talking to about this views it one way, and I don't, frankly, tend to spend a lot of time with the people who are in favor of Prop B. So I don't have a good sense of that as to whether the community perception has changed, or if certainly, well, I can tell you from the ECHO standpoint, it has not resulted in any material change in financial contributions. The biggest driver of financial contributions this year for ECHO was actually the winter storm. That's when people stopped and said, uh-oh, we've got people who are in this winter storm without any sort of housing or protection, even if they're in a tent. And I'll tell you that the most distressing statistic for me that came out of the winter storm was that we had 10 people for whom both their feet were amputated due to frostbite during the winter storm, and every one of them was homeless.
Tom Knudsen.
Yeah, one of the things I've observed, Ed, and I really appreciate, it's about the third time I've heard you talk about this, and homelessness is a problem nationwide, as we know. And I find it interesting that we're the Keep Boston Weird people, and we've criminalized homelessness. The city of Boston City Council last week declared homelessness a medical and mental health emergency and is addressing it that way. That's the difference between one city and one culture and another city and another culture.
No, I think that's right.
It's really sad.
Yeah. And I attribute the Prop B movement in part to a feeling of frustration that it became very visible very quickly, but there was not any sense that there was urgency to address it. So I think it was in addition to some political motivations, I think it was, but you know, people, I do know lots of people who were in favor of Prop B who would not normally be there, who I was surprised by it. I mean, obviously it passed by more than 50%. So it's gonna be interesting to see how this develops out. We've really got to make a substantial impact with the current funding that's going to become available and make that work. Otherwise, I don't think anyone will think it's solvable.
And I think this recent Prop A is just another part of that.
Let's take 2 more questions and then we will happily adjourn and thank Ed. Anybody have 2 more questions? 1 or 2? Yes, Deborah.
More of a comment. The level of complacency and people that would be in support of Prop B, it's out of sight, out of mind. I know it's not for everyone, but my personal choice is to go and personally serve and to get to know people. That is attitude changing, to know that these are our neighbors and we could potentially be there, or we potentially know people that could be there in a heartbeat. So I appreciate the efforts and I appreciate the education. And if you are able to meet some people who are living unhoused, that is definitely changing.
Oh, that's a great point. One of my better parenting experiences was when I took my oldest, who was then 15, to do the point in time count. So he went with us, and when we do that, we interview the folks that will talk to us and answer some questions. And so he did that interview, and so got to actually have a conversation with someone. And so I thought it really does make a difference when you can personalize it on a positive basis, not the negative basis, because it does happen downtown where someone's having a mental health crisis and I walk past them and they yell something, right? You got to move beyond and not let any of the individual incidents stereotype how you understand people. And so getting to know them is a good, I can't think of a better way. So
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate the questions, the conversation. Ed, thank you so much. I remember about 5 years ago, I think you were talking about ECHO and you said our program is going to be housing first. They're not going to have to go through rehab, mental health counseling. And that some people thought that was a very radical time, and it sounds like it's really worked. So my congratulations to you and my thanks.
but that has become the standard of care, which is nice.
That's great.
So,
Okay. See y'all later. Thank you so much.
thanks everybody.
you. Thank you very much.
Just stay on till everybody's on.
Common courses.
She's heard